Uriah Kriegel, visiting from the University of Arizona. His talk is entitled The Experiential Origins of Intentionality, and it's based on the first chapter of his book, his forthcoming book, The Origins of Intentionality, the Sources of Intentionality. Sorry. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and coming to my talk. Listening to it. That's all I can do. So, the goal of the talk is to argue that our conception of intentionality is grounded in our grasp of experiential intentionality. So our grasp of experiential intentionality, the intentionality proper to conscious experience, is the basis for our entire conception of intentionality or aboutness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a general model of concept formation and apply it to the concept of intentionality to generate the thesis that I want under goal, and then consider some objections and replies. So I'm starting with some possible accounts or models of how we form our conception of various phenomena. And I'm particularly interested in a subset of all possible concept formations. They're concerned with natural kind concepts, how we form natural kind concepts, and more specifically what I call observational natural kind concepts, which is basically just natural kind concepts, some instances of which we can observe, like a horse, the concept of a horse. It's a natural kind concept that you can observe instances of. You can observe horses. And so it's the observational natural kind concept. And I'm interested in not just any kind of formation of such concepts, but what I call non-parasitic concept formation. So if you think how we form the concept of a mammal, and therefore, just kidding. If you think how I form the concept of a mammal, I was just reading something, probably, or hearing something about mammals and learning mammals are. That's how I formed the concept of a mammal. And my students, I think, how they form the concept of a mammal is by wikiing it. You just look it up on Wikipedia, and then you know what a mammal is. But this way of acquiring the concept of a mammal depends on someone else acquiring the concept of a mammal. The person who wrote the Wikipedia entry needs to acquire the concept of a mammal in some other way. Well, they can read something else, but all this must bottom out in someone actually interacting with mammals and forming the concept of a mammal, like that. And so I'm interested in non-parasitic observational natural kind concept formation. And so these are models of that, not of any kind of concept formation. The first model is kind of a naive model. Well, they're all naive, but this one is the naivest. It's the criterion model. And basically the idea is that there is some criterion specifiable in terms of observable features of things that you form when you form a concept. So here's a more specific way of putting it. For any natural kind K, in particular X, there is a criterion C specifiable in terms of observable features, such that X qualifies as a K if and only if X satisfies C. So the idea here is that how do you non-parasitically form a concept of a mammal? You go out into the world and you start meeting mammals. When you're very little, you meet a cat. I think it's making it less cute. It's more cute. It's cuter on my lap.
There we go.
Yes. See? Substantially cuter. So you encounter cats, then you encounter dogs, and if you're lucky, you might encounter some sheep and a goat. And you notice that there's some similarity among all these things, that they're all furry, four-legged land animals with a certain kind of face. Eyes and nose, and there's a mouth, and they're kind of located, arranged spatially in the same way. So you kind of form a criterion on the basis of observing all these things. I'm not saying consciously, explicitly forming a criterion. A criterion is forming somehow, maybe subpersonally. And the criterion is this: something qualifies as a mammal just in case it is a furry, four-legged land animal with a good face, where a good face is the face with the right arrangement. And this criterion is effectively your concept of a mammal. Now, the reason I don't like this model, well, there's a lot, but here's one reason. I think it entails that certain discoveries cannot be made that seem to be possible. So there are some discoveries that seem possible, and the criterion says that they're impossible. So how do you discover that something is a mammal? On this view, you discover that it satisfies the criterion. So if you see this thing, if you've never seen one of those before, I don't know what it is, but you figure that it's a mammal because it satisfies your criterion. But this is the only way to discover that something is a mammal. If you meet then a whale, this is a very non-parasitic way of forming the concept of a mammal. You actually go and meet a whale. And if you meet a whale, it doesn't satisfy the criterion. So you cannot discover, according to this model, that the whale is a mammal. You can change your concept so that now it includes mammals. But that's not really what we did. We didn't decide to change our concept of a mammal when we saw the whale. We discovered that it was a mammal without changing. So the concept was always ready to subsume the whale under it. And this is something that the criterial model doesn't account for. Now, how do we know, how did we discover that the whale is a mammal? We discovered it by discovering that its DNA is 97% the same as a hippopotamus. This is actually a false history of science. And as I was saying this, I was remembering that I went to the University of Western Ontario. So someone probably knows that this is not exactly how it works. And that it's much more complicated. But let's crush the complexities and just say, this is how it happened. So you basically appeal to DNA, some kind of unobservable feature, which is the underlying nature of a mammal, some kind of genetic property that all and only mammals have. So this might lead you to the next model, which I call the underlying nature model, creatively. And here the idea is that for any natural kind K, in particular X, there is an underlying nature N, such that X qualifies as a K, if and only if X has N. So for you to qualify as a mammal, to qualify as falling under the concept, is just to have the right underlying nature. On this view, it doesn't really matter what the superficial or observable similarities are among mammals. It doesn't matter that the cow doesn't do these kinds of things. It has the right genetic property. And an advantage of this account is that it can explain how we can come to discover that the whale is a mammal. I don't know why I have this picture again. You discover it by discovering that the mammal has the right underlying nature. So you basically figure that something is a mammal just in case it has the right underlying nature. And then you discover that the whale does, and you figure out that that's a mammal. Now what the problem is with this account, I think, is the opposite of the problem with the previous account. The previous account had the problem that too few things were discoverable to be mammals. Here I think too many things are discovered. Certain discoveries that are not really possible are made possible by this view. For example, it could turn out that we made some mistake and cats and dogs and goats and horses, they don't have this underlying nature, and only the hippopotamus and the whale have them. And so it will turn out, on this view, that in this state of affairs, it would turn out that there are only two kinds of mammal in the world. And I think this is a priori not a discovery we can make. The concept of a mammal is such as to rule out this as a genuine possibility, that it doesn't really make sense for us to discover that the cats and the dogs and all these mammals that we constructed our concept of a mammal by dealing with turn out not to be mammals. So I'm willing to consider that maybe it can turn out that the dog doesn't have the same underlying nature as the cat and the goat and the horse and the hippopotamus, and then it will turn out that the dog is not a mammal. And maybe the same thing can happen with the cat, but it can't happen with all of them, because all of them together, they are the basis on which the concept was constructed. So it's just a concept that's based on dealing with them. I hope this is plausible. You will tell me if it's not. So why did I have this picture here? You may ask yourself. It's because it's another implication of this view that you could in principle discover that there aren't any mammals that we know, that there are some mammals are some imaginary creatures that don't actually exist, because no actual creature has the right underlying nature. But how do you decide what the right underlying nature is, if not by looking at those mammals you first had dealings with when you formed your concept of a mammal? That's what is bugging me in this account. And so this leads me to what I call the anchoring instance model, where you say that a creature qualifies as a mammal just in case it has the same underlying nature as cats, dogs, goats, horses, etc. All these mammals that you deal with when you interact with, when you form, during the period of forming the concept, whatever else happens to have the same underlying nature as them, or most of them, that's what counts as a mammal, the way our concept of a mammal works. And I want to say every observational natural kind concept that we have works like that. So I'm going to give a name to these cats and dogs and goats and horses. I'm going to call them anchoring instances of the concept of a mammal. I'm going to say that the creature qualifies as a mammal just in case it has the same underlying nature as the anchoring instances of the concept of a mammal. The anchoring instances are those instances that are observable instances you interact with or encounter during the period in which you're forming your concept of a mammal. Right, so that's anchoring instances. So to put it more precisely, for any natural kind k and particular x, there is a nature n such that x qualifies as a k, if and only if one. Most anchoring instances of k have n, at least most. And 2, x has n. So X has the same underlying nature as most anchoring instances of the concept. And this can explain, on the one hand, why we can discover that the whale is a mammal. Not just to discover that the whale has the same underlying nature as the anchoring instances of our concept of a mammal, namely dogs, cats, etc. Assuming that those are the ones, simplifying a bit. And on the other hand, you cannot discover that there are, in reality, no mammals, because that would be to discover that no animal has the same underlying nature as most cats, dogs, which is a logical contradiction. Because that would include the cats and the dogs, etc. Was that clear? I saw 5 positive notes and 1 negative one, so I'm moving on. So this is what I want to. Believe this anchoring instance model. Now it's obviously just a first approximation, and you need some tinkering here. So in the paper, I go through 70 different modifications and refinements. So I look into what we might say is involved in most anchoring instances having the underlying nature. And what counts as the anchoring instances at all? Just the individual cats and dogs that you meet, Garfield and Snoopy, etc., or all cats that are superficially similar to the ones that you met, or what? And I look into what involved in being an instance, and there's a bunch of qualifications and clarifications of each of these terms. But I'm not going to go into this here. It doesn't really bear on the main thrust of the argument. So, now that we have this general model of how we form observational natural kind concepts, maybe we can apply it to the concept of intentionality. That will require, of course, that the concept of intentionality is an observational natural kind concept. I think it's pretty natural to think of it that way, that we can observe certain instances of intentionality, we can see certain intentional things, and that it's a natural kind concept. It's not a manifest kind concept where just superficial similarities are the only similarities that matter. So this leads me to the following bit of reasoning. The first premise is that an item called... The first premise is just the anchoring instance model. It says that... Why am I not using this? It says that an item qualifies as a K just in case it has the same underlying nature as most anchoring instances of a K. All right? Second, the concept of intentionality is an observational natural kind concept. And therefore, the anchoring instance model applies to the concept of intentionality. So we get the conclusion that an item qualifies as an intentional just in case it has the same underlying nature as most anchoring instances of the concept of intentionality. Right? Now if you add to that the following cool-looking premise, which says that all anchoring instances of intentionality are experiential intentional states, states that have experiential intentionality, states that have intentionality that they have in virtue of being experiential, then you get a very strong conclusion, which some of you may see, that an item qualifies as intentional just in case it has the same underlying nature as most experiential intentional states. So this, let's just look at the conclusion, if we can, from the back there. This is basically a way of grounding the concept of intentionality in our grasp of experiential intentionality. So this bit of reasoning gives me the result that I wanted. Of course, it depends on this cool-looking premise that we'll have to defend, but if that premise is plausible as it looks, or as good as it looks. And I got confused by the grammar. Was it Kate Moss who said, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels? Skinny feels? I think I need something like this grammar to say what I was going to say. I know about Kate Moss from my students. So this is basically the conclusion of the previous argument, that an item qualifies as intentional just in case it has the same underlying nature as most experiential intentional states, that is, states endowed with experiential intentionality. And to put it in a nicer, more rigorous form, and this will be just the first approximation, for any item X, X qualifies as intentional if and only if there is a nature N such that one, most experiential intentional states have N and two, X has N. That's the experiential origin thesis, first approximation of the right way to put it. Then you need 70 modifications and then you can be happy. So all this depends, of course, on this premise, this cool-looking premise coming out true, that all anchoring instances of the concept of intentionality are experiential intentional states. And why do I believe it's true? I believe it's true because you remember that we said that anchoring instances of a concept are those manifest instances that one encounters during the formation of one's concept, the relevant concept. So it looks like all anchoring instances are ones that need to be encountered at some point. And I will want to claim that only experiential intentional states can be encountered in the right sense. And that too will have to be shown. So the initial argument looks like this. All the anchoring instances of intentionality are instances encountered during the formation of the concept of intentionality. That's just the model, the anchoring instance model. The second premise is that the only instances encountered during the formation of the concept of intentionality are experiential intentional states. There are no other instances of intentionality that can be encountered during the formation of the concept of intentionality. This will have to be shown. And so the conclusion is that all the anchoring instances of intentionality are experiential intentional states, which is the fourth premise of the big argument. Now, this business about encountering, it seems to me that when we talk about observational concepts, encountering an instance means observing it, establishing some kind of observational contact with it, direct observational contact. And so my thought is that we can only have direct observational contact with our own experiential intentional states of all intentional items. This will have to be shown. So something always has to be shown, as Liana said to me last night. If we understand this encounter business in terms of this notion of observational contact, then the argument looks like this. The anchoring instances, all of them are such that we have some observational contact with them, and the only kind of intentional states we can have observational contact with are experiential intentional states. And then you get your conclusion, which is the fourth premise of the other thing that gives you the conclusion of the other. Now, this business about direct observational contact it seems a bit spooky to a lot of people. What is this business of direct observational contact, especially with your own experiences? Sounds too Cartesian. I agree that it sounds Cartesian, but to me it also sounds true. So I think that it's very intuitive, actually, that when think about, yeah, do me a favor, imagine, visualize a tiny dragon on your hand. I couldn't find a picture of this, so I had to take the picture myself. This is what I need you to visualize. I needed to visualize holding this tiny little dragon in your hand. And now, how do you know what you're visualizing? It's a very natural thing to say, well, I know that visualizing this and not a three-headed kangaroo. I couldn't find a picture of that either. Yeah, it's very natural to say that it's just by direct observational contact in some sense. And it's maybe elusive just how it works, but in some sense we just have direct awareness of our experience being as of a tiny dragon and not a three-headed kangaroo. So that seems natural. But in addition to naturalness, maybe we can give an argument, and this is what I want to do next, to give an argument. This will be an argument by inference to the best explanation. And it will work like this. I'm sorry, there are more premises. The first premise is that some experiential intentional states, but no other kinds of intentional states, can be ascribed without use of a principle of charity of this kind that Davidson was talking about a lot. And I'll get into what this means in a second. So only experiential intentional states can be ascribed in this way. And this requires explanation. Why should it be that there is this asymmetry between our ascription of experiential intentional states to ourselves and other kinds of intentional ascription? Why should that be? It can't be a sort of a brute fact. Something must explain it. And here's a good explanation, I claim. I claim that the best explanation is of this fact is that we have direct observational contact with those experiential intentional states, but not with any other kind of intentional state. This is the best explanation of why there is this asymmetry. And I will argue that there is this asymmetry in the state. And if that's the case, then we should, by inference to the best explanation, we should accept that we have direct observational contact with some experiential intentional states and with no other kinds of intentional states. So you remember Davidson with his business about all intentional ascription. According to him, all intentional ascription is governed by a principle of charity. And I want to say, no, not all of it. Just the ones that, just ascriptions of states that don't have experiential intentionality. First, let's remember a little bit what is this charity business. The charity business is that any competent interpreter must use, always, in every instance, must use a principle of charity to ascribe intentional states to the interpretee. So there is a passage where he explains it and motivates it pretty well. It goes like this. If you see a ketch sailing by and your companion says, "Look at that handsome yawl," you may be faced with a problem of interpretation. One natural possibility is that your friend has mistaken a ketch for a yawl and has formed a false belief. But if his vision is good and his line of sight favorable, it is even more plausible that he does not use the word yawl quite as you do. and has made no mistake at all about the position of the jigger on the passing yacht. Now, at one level, I have no idea what he's talking about here. I just figured that we didn't grow up in the same neighborhood. But in another sense, I understand exactly what he says. Suppose I say, look at this. This is an excellent tiger. It's, first of all, it's very portable. It's very small. It's a very small tiger, very portable tiger. And you can use it very easily to move the slides, this tiger, to move the slides. So you have two interpretations possible to you. Either I believe that this is a good, useful tiger, and I use the word tiger to mean tiger. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that I believe that this is a good remote control, and that I use the word tiger to mean remote control. These are the two interpretations open to you. Now, if you're a competent interpreter, you will choose the second interpretation, where I said something sensible. And what causes you to choose this second interpretation is nothing about the data. The data at your disposal, the kinds of things that you heard me saying, don't really don't discriminate between these two possible interpretations. The only thing that pushes you towards the second interpretation is charity. And you need to be charitable if you are going to be a competent speaker in general, a competent interpreter. So competent interpretation requires the application of a principle of charity. Now, he says a very interesting thing later on in the same page, I think, or maybe the next page, to diagnose what happened here. So here's the diagnosis. If we merely know that someone holds a certain sentence to be true, we know neither what he means by the sentence, nor what belief his holding it true represents. His holding the sentence true is thus the vector of two forces. So it's a vector of two forces. And it being a vector of two forces, the data at your disposal as a speaker, as an interpreter, are the vector of two forces, because there are two different forces that combine to generate the data. And because of that, when you ascribe to me one belief, you have at the same time to ascribe to me some other mental fact, say about what I believe certain words to mean. So this is what I will call the vector of two forces observation. And I want to say that this observation is true of most intentional ascription, but not all. The ascription of experiential intentional states does not involve data that are the vectors of two forces. And this will be an asymmetry between the two kinds of ascription. And this asymmetry will require explanation. And the best explanation will be that we have direct observational contact only with some, but only with experiential intentional states. And the fact that we have this direct observational contact will be the reason to accept that fourth premise in that big argument for the final conclusion, right? I barely remember the whole dialectic, so don't feel bad if you don't remember exactly what all this was. So here's a thesis. Let's look at 4 different kinds of intentional ascription. Intentional ascription of experiential intentional states to yourself. This will be this, first person experiential intentional ascription. Then there is first person intentional ascription of non-experiential intentional states. So it's ascribing to yourself non-experiential states. Then there is ascribing to another experiential states, and there is ascribing to another non-experiential states. These are four. This square is four. It's not in it. Possible kinds of intentional ascription, and I want to claim that first person experiential intentional ascription, so ascription to yourself of experiential intentional states, does not have to rely on data that are the vectors of two forces. Remember, this sounds like a tiny, tiny point, but it's all needed to create this inference by best explanation argument. So why is that? Let's look first at some kind of paradigmatic cases of third person ascription of non-experiential states. So suppose you see Dennett tells this story in some place. Suppose you see someone opening, it starts raining, he says, and someone is opening the umbrella. Why are they opening the umbrella? Well, because they want to be dry, he says, and they think that the umbrella will help. It's a pretty straightforward explanation, and that's what competent interpreters would do. These are the intentional states, the belief and the desire that they would ascribe to this umbrella opener, the umbrella opening agent. Now notice, he says, that you need a principle of charity even here, because if the person did not want to be dry, then the fact that they believe that opening the umbrella will help them stay dry would not explain why they opened the umbrella. And if the person did not believe that opening the umbrella would help them stay dry, then they wouldn't open the umbrella even if they desired to stay dry. So you can't really ascribe here the belief in isolation from the desire or the desire in isolation from the belief. You have to ascribe them together. You have to ascribe two mental states at once, a belief and a desire. And it's in that sense that your datum, the datum is just you seeing them opening the umbrella. The datum is a vector of two forces in that sense, that you have to ascribe two states. You have to assume that two states, two intentional states together conspired to bring about this datum, this opening of the umbrella. And this seems in general to be how causal inference works in the mental domain. That when you, on the basis of some data, ascribe intentional states to someone else, you will need to ascribe to them two intentional states to cause the behavior that's observable. This seems to be in general as if a kind of a causal inference where you posit non-observable causes of the observable effects. Just like you observe smoke and you posit that there's fire. It's a completely unnecessary picture. Whoa, this is a cool one, but we're not there. Compare ascription of experiential intentional states to yourself, like the ascription of the dragon experience. It doesn't seem like there you need to ascribe anything else. There's no datum at your disposal such that you have to ascribe to yourself two different mental states, two intentional states that together conspire to generate this datum. The datum is presumably some kind of introspective datum of the sort, I seem to myself to have this experience of a dragon. And all you need to do in order to ascribe to yourself this experience of a dragon is to endorse this introspective seeming. So here the way the ascription seems to work is a little bit like what is called the endorsement model in the case of perception, where people say that you form a perceptual belief to the effect that there is a tree in front of you simply by endorsing the perceptual seeming that there is a tree. So it seems to you perceptually that there's a tree in front of you, and you endorse that seeming. You say to yourself, the endorsing means things are the way they seem to be. That's the endorsing. And likewise, if you ascribe to yourself if you don't just ascribe treehood to an object, but instead ascribe tree experiencehood to some experience that you have, this seems to me to be just some kind of endorsement of an introspective seeming. So it introspectively seems to you that there is an experience as of a tree, and you endorse that introspective seeming. This seems to be the natural model of how to explain this kind of ascription, given that you can ascribe to yourself only one intentional state in this kind of case. You don't have to ascribe several ones. You can ascribe to yourself just an experience of the tree, or just an experience of the dragon. You don't have to ascribe to yourself at the same time any other state. So the datum is in the introspective seeming, and what causes the introspective seeming is presumably the experience that it seems to you that you have. And this experience is the only thing you have to suppose is causing this experience. So this suggests some kind of direct introspective contact with the experience of the dragon or the tree. Why else would you be able, what's special it seems here in this case, is that you are aware directly of that which you ascribe to yourself. You ascribe to yourself that which you observe, namely the experience of a tree or a dragon. And so this is sort of, like I said, the best explanation of why this kind of ascription seems to be different. Now, there are other kinds of ascription that I don't want to go through because I've talked already for 45 minutes. So I'm going to skip some pictures, even though they're fun. And I'm going to go straight to what this all seems to lead to, that if you accept that the best explanation of the fact that when you ascribe to yourself an experiential intentional state, your data are not the vector of two forces, but in other kinds of intentional ascription they are, is that you have direct introspective contact, direct observational contact with what you ascribe in the case of ascribing to yourself experiential intentional states, then you get a reason to believe the second premise here. Remember that the only instances of intentionality with which we have direct observational contact are experiential intentional states. And this was a way of unpacking this thing in terms of instances encountered during the formation of the concept of intentionality. And all this was leading to the conclusion that all the anchoring instances of intentionality are experiential intentional states, which was the fourth premise of this argument, whose conclusion is this thesis, which is the experiential origin thesis I argued for just now, I guess. I just now finished arguing for it in the past, however long. Thank you for following all this. I'm going to compliment myself by saying that this was followable. So this is the argument that applying the anchoring instance model of concept formation to the formation of the concept of intentionality leads to our concept of intentionality being grounded in our grasp of experiential intentionality. So, coming to the last bit, I guess pretty fast, I'll have to go through this. Some objections and replies. You can, this is the argument. The objections will target this particular bit of the argument where all the action is, right? This is where the whole complicated argument ends with this syllogism. So you can reject premise one by, remember, I should have done it differently. Remember, premise one is that all the anchoring instances of intentionality are instances which we have direct observational contact. You might reject this by saying that this is too empiricist. Actually, we don't form. Basically, by rejecting the anchoring instance model is too empiricist. That's one kind of objection we can have. Another kind of objection to the idea that we have direct observational contact only with experiential intentional states, and at least with some of them, you could object that we do not, in fact, have observational contact with experiential intentional items at all. Or you could reject this premise by saying we do, but we also have observational contact with other kind of intentional items that are not experiential intentional states. And finally, you can just reject the conclusion. Completely legitimate way of arguing. It's to say that the conclusion will just give you less intentionality in the world than there seems to be. All right, so quickly going through these objections. The first objection was that there's some kind of undue empiricism here, and that the natural kind concepts are not formed on the basis of encounter with instances. Now, I want to say that this seems to me reasonable, that this is too empiricist for certain kind of natural kind concepts. For example, the concept of a lepton. The concept of a lepton, maybe you form it, you don't need any kind of encounter with leptons. But I think that's because the concept of a lepton, even though it's a natural kind concept, it's not an observational natural kind concept. Remember that the observational natural kind concept is a concept where you have the ability to observe some instances of things that fall under the concept. And it seems very strange to say, to me, it seems very strange to say that you can acquire or form the concept of things which you can observe regardless of any observing of them. So you can form, non-parasitically form, the concept of a horse, for example, regardless of your observation of horses. That the observation of horses is not really essential to the forming of the concept of a horse. This seems to me very strange. So my reply is to just remind the objector that empiricism is bad when it's empiricism gone wild, when it's trying to apply itself to too many concepts. But if you restrict it to concepts that are what we call empirical concepts, it sounds very reasonable. And that's all I'm doing. Because the model is supposed to apply to observational natural kind concepts. Now, the second objection was that we don't actually have any observational contact with experiential intentional states. We become aware of them and we ascribe them to ourselves, or become in a position to describe them in some other way, not through observational contact. I say that's fine to say, but you still need to explain the asymmetry. Remember, this was an argument by inference to the best explanation. There is an asymmetry between our ascription of experiential intentional states and our ascription of other intentional states, and this needs explanation. One straightforward explanation is that there is direct observational contact there, in one case and not the other. If you reject that, you need to supply another explanation, an alternative and better explanation. So, this is, I guess, what I just said, and yet I will read it. The objector must offer an alternative, superior explanation of the fact that some experiential intentional states and no non-experiential intentional states can be ascribed without using the principle of charity. Now, I'm not ruling out that this is possible. So in that sense, it's not a demonstrative argument, because it's an argument by inference to the best explanation, but I still need to see it. The third and final objection was that we may have direct observational contact with some non-experiential mental states or with some non-mental intentional thingies. So in the first case, sometimes people say that you can directly observe the mental state of another. For example, you can directly observe that this guy is afraid. And you don't need to infer this from anything. It's automatic and it's immediate that you that this person has the intentional state of fearing something. And even though that's not you, you can ascribe it to them. So in reply to this, I would say that it's still a vector of two forces here, because we can only ascribe fear of something if we also ascribe the belief. That doesn't have to be a conscious belief or anything. It needs to be some kind of commitment, some kind of doxastic commitment to the object of fear being dangerous or threatening or in general bad for you. That if you think that if you don't ascribe this belief, the person's fear is unintelligible. You can't really understand why the person is afraid of something that they don't believe is dangerous. Sometimes people say you don't have to believe in the movie theater. You see things that are not dangerous and you're afraid, and then other people, so some people say that is a kind of belief, and other people say no, that's a different kind of intentional state, which is an A-leaf, some people call it. But some kind of intentional state has to be ascribed in tandem with the fear. So that's the case, the first case, the case of ascribing non-experiential mental states to another. And the final, the other kind was where you see some kind of intentional item that's not at all mental. So let's say some kind of traffic sign. This is a traffic sign that you interpret as intentional. It's about something, right? And you ascribe to it this intentional content just on the basis of direct observation. And this happens in many other areas. For example, art. You can see this as representing baseball, or language, for example. These words represent something. And these are all cases where you can see immediately. Susanna Siegel argues, for example, that with language, you see the meaning of the words. You don't just see marks and then infer that they have a meaning. You see it, you see them as meaningful. Now, I want to say that all this sounds right, but it seems to me that here too, in order to see something like this as meaningful, you have to already possess intentional concepts. You already have to have a conception of intentionality or aboutness. So these things present themselves as intentional only to someone who already possesses the concept of intentionality. So they cannot be things that you have direct intentional contact, direct observational contact with before you already have the concept of intentionality. And if that's the case, they're not going to be anchoring instances of intentionality. Now, the last objection is that you're not going to get all the intentionality that you want to get, because a lot of these things that are intentional in the world, like language, do not have the same underlying nature as experiential intentional states. And if that's the case, you'll have to deny that language has intentionality. The answer to this is to write a whole other chapter in the book. That's the answer to this. And the point of that chapter would be to say that there are two options here. Either some instances of intentionality that are not experientially intentional have the same underlying nature as experiential intentional states, but everything else would have everything else, its intentionality would have to be explained somehow in terms of the intentionality of experience, and to be shown to be merely derivative from the intentionality of experience. And there's a chapter for that. General idea is that all these things that seem to be intentional and don't have the underlying nature of experiential intentionality are interpretable by an ideal interpreter as intentional, and the ideal interpreter uses some kind of experiential interpretation. He experientially interprets these things to be intentional. So this is just a promise that this makes sense, and B can account for all the cases of intentionality that seem to be genuine cases of intentionality, but don't have the underlying nature of experiential intentional states. And I believe this is it. These are all my answers to the objections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Uriah has agreed to take his own questions. So
You have one behind you.
All right. Please.
So my question rests on an assumption that an important subset of the set of anchoring instances are going to be the desire or the will to speak, to engage in the composition of a token with others. Anyway, so there's this old kind of saying, or this old maxim that whoever wills the end also wills the means. You know. If I will or desire the end of speaking, I, according to that maxim, also will or desire to breathe in a measured way, to shape my tongue in a certain way, to shape my jaw and my lips, and so on and so forth. These acts of will, these additional concomitant acts of will, are not, they're not merely unconscious, they're not even accessible. There's no sort of access criterion or access condition that can be satisfied for them. Wouldn't those be cases where we have non-experiential intentionality going on just in the act of engaging in simple utterance?
So I don't immediately accept it as plausible that when we desire to speak, we desire to shape our tongue in a certain way or position it in a certain way. But let's say that that's the case. So we have such desires, and they're non-experiential. very non-experiential, like you said, not even potentially experiential. The bit that I have to deny is that I'm happy with them existing and having intentionality, but I have to deny that they are anchoring instances. And I deny this by saying that we don't encounter these kinds of things. They're pretty theoretical posits. If I ascribe this to anyone, if I ascribe certainly to myself, but actually to anybody else, a desire to position their tongue in a certain way, that's not going to be something that I have a direct observational contact with. It's something that I posit as part of a theory of how speech is produced. And because of that, I'll say they're not anchoring instances. So that's the bit that I would have to deny. So I'm going in this direction, if that's cool. I don't know why.
Eric, comment?
So, I don't think that I quite agree with your analysis of what we have of what you say that we directly encounter, and in part because I don't agree with the idea that we must have a principle of charity when we experience other people's actions. So, just to try to make that clear, since it's related to a slight confusion I have in your use of intentional, because you seem to use the following examples of something that are intentional. My perception of something in my hand, my experience of someone else's fear. I don't normally think of fear as an intentional state. People have panic attacks that have no object whatsoever, but are still profound fear. Someone's opening an umbrella. So it's not clear to me what these all have in common that makes them all intentional. But if I accept this usage, then it does seem to me, in fact, when I see someone have a panic attack, I don't need to ascribe any sort of belief to them about something's being dangerous or any belief whatsoever. Part of the character of a panic attack is that it is irrational. To give a more complex example, when I see you here doing what I understand as giving a talk, to say that I'm interpreting you or that it's a principle of charity just seems to me completely OTOs, because I'm sure I'm a philosopher. I can come up with other possible things you might be doing, exercising your lungs. You might mistakenly believe this is a star chamber and you're defending yourself against a charge of murder. But those are so silly that they're not really viable options. And so if I want to understand what you're doing, I don't see anything really different than my understanding of what I'm doing here as listening to your talk. It seems to me that if you say, in order to understand you're giving a talk, I must ascribe to you, I have to provide interpretation. I see no difference than in describing and trying to understand what I'm doing here either, because I can come up with the same silly alternatives to what I'm actually doing here. I'm looking for a new chair for my office, just decided to come down and try out this chair, and God, I got stuck in this talk. So what I really don't see how it is that all these things have in common, some of which are direct for me and not, but some of which aren't.
All right. So we try to remove some of the unclarity. I didn't mean to imply, first of all, that opening the umbrella is intentional. I meant to imply that the causes of opening the umbrella, the belief and the desire to stay dry, and the belief that opening the umbrella will help are intentional. The opening of the umbrella is the datum on the basis of which the intentional ascription is made, but I didn't mean to imply that it's itself intentional, though someone might argue that it is. About fear, I guess it's true that I assume that it's intentional, in line with some work that suggests that emotions and feelings are intentional. For example, the intentional object of fear is the dangerous in general. And you could deny that. Some people say that that's not the case, that fear is not intentional. If fear is not intentional, if you have this view, I don't have this view, I think that fear is intentional, but if you have the view that it's not intentional, then it's true that ascription of fear will not be intentional ascription. And then I wouldn't even discuss it. This wouldn't be part of the discussion, because I'm talking about intentional ascriptions. So I think that's partly. Does it help with these two cases why there was an appearance of heterogeneity in the group, and maybe there's more homogeneity now that I've made clear what my assumptions are about fear and about opening umbrellas?
Not quite, because if you exclude, so let's take the case of observing that there's something small in my hand. The only thing that I can think of that that has in common with sitting here listening is that I can explain what I'm doing in each case. But this is an active perception. I normally don't think of it as something intentional. I don't will myself to look at the thing in my hand or understand it as a dragon, as a small dragon. And in the more complex cases, if I see you looking at something in your hand, I'm probably going to assume that you're seeing a small dragon in your hand as well. And that's going to be just either as direct or indirect is what I do. And in the more complex cases where it seems that I'm engaged in manifestly intentional action, such as listening to you talk.
So here intentional means, here intentional is not really tied to the will and intention, the way I use it. It's tied to aboutness. And so there's some background that I should have explained. And so, but maybe we can talk about it later. Maybe you want to...
Yeah. I'm still...
Do you want to direct it? Go ahead.
Just a short one. So, the first part of your talk, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the distinction between, like, say, the concept of a mammal and the underlying nature of a mammal, and how the process of discovery works, how you can discover another instance to be.
It's a short one, and the answer is shorter. The answer is no, I cannot, because I haven't figured out in my own head how the mechanics work. So it's definitely very underdeveloped. Like I said, all three models are pretty naive, and they're supposed to be toy models. I think I better be more explicit on this, but give a general direction for an account of concept formation. So I don't know exactly how it works, how it would work under the underlying nature model for us to form the concept. This cannot be a satisfying answer. You have a question?
I think what I'm interested in is the empiricism. And I'm wondering why it's not going to be the case that given first-person observational experience as the foundation of, as the anchoring instances or concepts, why is it that I'm not going to always have different concepts than you?
Yes, that's there's two parts to my answer to this. I think it's a good worry to have. And in fact, I don't think we have identical concepts. But what we have are similar concepts, and concepts that probably are coextensive. So all things that count as mammal in my concept count as mammals in your concept, and vice versa, even though your anchoring instances are different than mine. So suppose you grew up with the cats and the dogs, and I was on a farm with the sheep and the pigs. And we have different anchoring instances. Still, because the underlying nature of everything that has the same underlying nature as cats and dogs is identical to the underlying nature of everything that has the underlying nature of sheep and pigs, will end up having coextensive concepts, even though there's a sense in which we don't have this very same concept of a mammal. But I think the coextension is what enables communication to work. And this is in the theory of concepts. It's often thought that concepts, in order for genuine communication to occur between people when they discuss, say, mammals, either the concepts must be identical, or at least they must be coextensive. The coextension will ensure that they actually communicate with each other and not talking past each other. And I think that's, I do get the coextension here in this account of concepts, but I don't get identity of concepts. Although, part of the thing is, you remember maybe that I said that once I have this anchoring instance model, I have 70 million different clarifications. And one of the clarifications was of anchoring and what qualifies as an anchoring instance. And there are, like I said, the extreme version is where it's just the individual token animals that you met and I met when we were little. And in that case, it will be very different. But if it was, even though I met different cats and you met different cats, it's once you meet a cat, it's anything that's like vaguely looks like a cat counts as an anchoring instance. Then we would have the same anchoring instances. So in the paper I described several ways you could go with this. And I say we really should adopt whichever account of anchoring gives us the best prediction of when people do have the same concept or different concepts.
Perhaps as well a stronger conception of intentionality, something more fleshed out, would provide more, less obscurity with respect to the concepts and a slightly stronger ground for knowledge.
Yes.
That would take you away from empiricism.
That will take me to the next book probably.
I guess mine's kind of piggybacking, or sort of. I was wondering how you dealt, or how one would know if their intentional ascriptions were true. Like, how do you deal with error and mistakes?
Sorry, how you would know whether what you're ascribing, or I guess here's a problem. Tell me if this problem is the kind of problem that you have in mind. That sometimes we ascribe false, erroneous beliefs and perceptions. And
Yeah.
and if if charity was at play so much, how would we ever be able to do that?
Sure.
Is that the kind of concern?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Yes. Here's how I see charitable ascription as working. There's two steps. First, you bring your data to bear to rule out a bunch of otherwise possible interpretations that are inconsistent with the data, so we're not going to take them into account. And then among the possible interpretations that remain possible after you've done that, because they're still consistent with the data, you choose the most charitable one, the one that maximizes the truth and rationality of the beliefs of the person you ascribe the belief to. But sometimes the data are going to rule out any possible interpretation that makes the subject's beliefs true. So sometimes the data they will never be strong enough, it seems to me, to rule out every interpretation, but they can rule out, in some cases maybe, the behavior of someone is such that it rules out any interpretation is believing something true. So, for example, I say, this tiger works really well. And maybe you press me a little bit and you say, no, but tiger is not a word for a remote control. Or I don't know, we do some, and I persist with this. Maybe eventually the data, with all my behavior, everything that I say and do, maybe I'm bringing a steak for this to eat. Maybe eventually the data are such, that you say to yourself, no charitable interpretation, no interpretation such that Uriah believes something true is possible here. You would still have several possible interpretations, and you probably, as a competent interpreter, have to pick the one where I make the most sense. But that's...
I guess we can't be sure then? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
This is my first thought, I must say. I haven't thought about this. This is a good thing to think about. Yes?
So I think this was something that Eric already raised, but to one question about the claim you make about direct observational access to experiential and intentional states is why you couldn't have an account where all access to those kinds of intentional states is inferential, and then the first and third person cases differ in degree but not in kind, right? So that you could say, well, it's not that there's a difference in kind, it's not that I have direct observational contact or sort of inner Cartesian theater, I just have a hell of a lot more data about myself that allows me to make an inference about my intentional states much more securely than an inference I might try to make about your intentional state. So it isn't that one case involves the principle of charity, vector sum of two forces, all that, and the other case involves direct observational access, but instead it's a difference of degree. So another question is, if you grant that, so I'm guessing you're going to disagree with that, but it also wasn't clear to me what the impact of that line would be, given that, so you want to say that there's a direct observational access to anchoring instances in order to apply that account of concept formation, but it wasn't clear to me why you couldn't be slightly more liberal in understanding the notion of observational and contact with anchoring instances. But
so the first bit was wasn't exactly an alternative explanation of the explanandum in the inference of the best explanation, because some of it was denying the explanandum, right? So you were saying there isn't this sharp asymmetry there.
Right, there isn't, yeah.
What if I just restrict myself to a very narrow explanandum, which is that these ones can be ascribed without ascribing anything else, and these ones cannot be ascribed without ascribing anything else. Would you reject this explanandum as just false, or would you offer a different explanation of that particular?
So I guess the suggestion is that I would reject it as false.
Right.
I mean, this isn't.
Yes, but doesn't it sound right? That's my rejoinder. I mean, we went through some examples, and I realized we went through it a little fast, but I we are very fast. This takes 20 pages in paper and 8 minutes here. So we went through it fast, but I'm kind of attached to this explanation is right, having gone through the 20 pages. It seems, just doesn't seem right that either that you cannot ascribe an experiential intentional state without ascribing another intentional state. That doesn't sound right to me. And it also doesn't sound right to me that there is non-experiential intentional states that you can ascribe without ascribing anything else. So I guess I'm sticking by my explanandum and would have to be convinced to relinquish it. I think there is in the vicinity of this explanandum another explanandum, which is that our inscription to ourselves is more secure, I think you said, of experiential state, it's more secure, and I think it's true that that explanandum is not such that the best explanation of it is that we have direct observational contact. I mean, I actually think it probably is a very good explanation. Why? Why our ascription of experiential intentional states to ourselves is more secure than other kinds of ascription. But in relation to this explanandum, I will agree that there is another explanation that may be just as good, namely the one you suggested, that we just have more information.
Right.
But my explanandum is a little bit different.
It's a little different, right?
Yeah.
I see that now.
Yes, please.
So I'm wondering whether you could tell us what definition of natural kind you're working with in the beginning part of the paper. So I mean, first of all, obviously mammals might not count under some definitions, but that's not really important. Well, the reason I think it's important is that premise 2 of your main argument depends on counting intentional states as natural kinds, right?
So I should say that when in the paper I considered the objection that that premise is false, one of the ways that objection could play out is by denying that the concept of a mammal is a natural kind concept. And what I say there is that if it seems to me that let's call them other concepts that are non-natural kind concepts, but are still kind concepts. Let's call them manifest kind concepts. So it seems to me that this account that I gave of the formation of natural kind concepts extends to manifest kind concepts, or has a sister account for manifest kind concepts that suggests itself, which is that just like something qualifies as a member of a natural kind, just in case it has the same underlying nature as the anchoring instances, so something qualifies as a member of a manifest kind just in case it has the observable features of the anchoring instances. So the anchoring instances will be the same, and what you will need to prove in order to qualify as a member of the manifest kind would be that you have the same observational features. So if intentionality is a manifest kind, then, and it's true that only experiential intentional states are anchoring instances, then what would follow for other instances of intentionality is that they have the same superficial observable features as experiential intentional states, which would still retain the grounding of our conception of intentionality in our grasp of experiential intentionality. So what I claim is that if it turns out that intentionality is not a natural kind concept, but a manifest kind concept, that by itself actually doesn't undermine the case for intentionality, the concept of intentionality being grounded in our grasp of experiential intentionality, if you accept the sister account. So it's epidialectical, I say. It's epiphenomenal in a dialectic. But to the other question, the background question of what I mean by natural kinds, I'm not sure. I think that natural kinds, the best way to think of them are kinds such that there seem to be objective similarity relations among the members, and where the similarity does not have to be at the superficial, observable level. But I'm not sure this is the best way of thinking of natural kinds. So I'm yeah, maybe suboptimal answer. Yes.
So I was struggling with formulating this question because it has some different angles. So one part of it is I guess I'm confused a little bit by your use of psychology. So confused by why you want to talk about concept formation instead of what concepts are. And it seems to me there's a potential sort of slide on the notion of grounding, where so you want to say, because this is how concept formation works, maybe something like this, our concept of intentionality is grounded in experiential intentionality. But that notion of grounding, it's not clear to me whether that's sort of logical or historical. You see what I mean? Or genetic. So that's the general question, and to make it, just tell you where it came from for me. So, I mean, it seems like you're resting a lot on this psychological, developmental psychological story about how people actually, small children, babies, actually come to form the intentional concept that they do. And I think that that's probably a pretty complicated question. I doubt that it's empirical entirely. I bet we come with part of it. And I think that the example of mammal isn't very good, and maybe you might use the example of object or something like that, right? I mean, sure, we have anchoring instances of object, physical objects early in babies, or objects you can move around, blocks or whatever. But surely, I mean, I want to say that we come equipped with a tendency to chunk the world into experience into objects, and I think we come equipped with a tendency to see intentional relations. So if you sort of stuff that I've read recently about what's happening in early cognitive development suggests that the baby's ability to attribute intentional states to themselves, that is, to recognize what's being said when asked, do you want milk, right? And their ability to attribute intentional states to others, and their ability to attribute, to recognize pictures as being pictures of something. But that all happens right at the same time. And it would surprise me if the self-conscious kind, the kind that requires you to back off and say, not only do I feel this, but oh, that's a desire, or oh, that's a thought, or that's a thought, that's a belief. That it seems extremely unlikely to me, as in point of empirical fact, that would actually come before being able to recognize other people as wanting things, or recognize that moment. There's a sort of exciting moment in baby development when suddenly they see a picture of a cat as a cat, and I think they just look at the thing and say, cat, what? Astonishing thing. This flat object is a cat somehow, and the addition of the second vector saying, oh, this is something that somebody intended to represent a cat, but that's something that comes much later. So I think that, my own belief is that the historical, the genetic story, psychological developmental story, is something quite different than the one that you're sketching. But I don't know that obviates the logical argument, logical grounding argument. So I kind of want to, that's the question.
So it's a kind of a two-step objection.
Yeah.
The first step is to say, this account of concept formation isn't right. And the second step is to say, even if it is right, it only gives you one kind of grounding, but not a cooler kind of grounding.
Right, but on the other hand, maybe you can get the cooler kind of grounding without the psychological support.
All right, so I'm very concerned about the first step in the two-step objection. I see it as a version of the third objection that I presented, and specifically version B.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I am keen to stress, and stress more, I guess, in the paper than I did here, is that ascription of intentional states that I envisage in subjects that don't yet possess intentional concepts is not very fancy, it's not very self-aware, it's not very conceptual. It's not that they possess the concept of a desire and they ascribe it and they apply it to something. It's they just have introspection and they are aware introspectively of things that are in fact intentional states. And that's the first encounters with things that are intentional that they have. Now there is a bit of an embarrassment there in that it's true that they all come online at the same time, the ability to ascribe. Well, this is what we know right now about belief ascription and desires. Well, mostly belief ascription and some intention ascription. I don't know in research about desire. But belief ascription seems to come on at the same time for oneself and for another. I wonder if this I wonder if this is something I can live with by saying that there are certain perceptual states that you ascribe to yourself in this kind of implicit or non-conceptual way before you can ascribe them to others. Even though there's a sense in which it's all automated and built on simulation or something like that, it's probably on simulation. It still seemed to me, based on data that are the vectors of two forces, because you have to at the same time assume that they consider something in their presence as dangerous. That they cannot ascribe the fear without ascribing this other mode of psastic state.
Right. I think that that's wrong.
I see. And you think that this is the wrongness of this comes out of neuron theory?
Maybe we can continue this later informally, but please join me in thanking our speakers.